name is Lily Green.
And I'm Darcy Lewis, and this is
The Politics Hydra.
Here at this podcast, we see similarities between Heracles' trials and the American political complex. When you attempt to unpack one issue, two more grow in its place. And since Heracles was busy, you've got us.
We slay this Hydra not for glory, but for the sake of exploration and further academic inquiry. Here we believe American politics are complex, multifaceted, and worth exploring. Throughout this multi-part series, we will attempt to identify, define, dissect, and discuss facets of American politics that we find pressing and current.
So, Lily, what was this podcast supposed to be about today?
It was initially supposed to be about anti-immigration sentiment in the United States. And, I had gotten through the history, or at least a general synopsis of it, starting back with like Benjamin Franklin. But when I started getting into, modern day anti-immigration sentiment and acts and policies, I found this model, and it's called the Overton model, that seemed to explain what was going on behind these racist comments we were seeing in mainstream media, what was like subvertly going on behind the scenes. And it's not to lessen the anti-immigration sentiment, but I think one of the goals of this podcast is to, like I said, dissect what's going on around us. When you see these things on the news, it's a strategic attempt to do something else. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So I figured this would be a good opportunity to showcase how one issue in politics can have a lot of issues underneath. It can be extremely multifaceted, aka a hydra of sorts.
I'm glad you're utilizing the flexibility that we tried to start with this podcast, because whenever we initially started with this idea, we had a list of things that we thought we would be interested in dissecting on this podcast. And so I'm kind of glad that you're branching outside of our little list.
Well, yeah, I wanted to talk about something that I feel like maybe other people aren't hearing about. We're hearing a lot about anti-immigration sentiment, and that's a big deal. And we're going to talk about these examples of these issues in the podcast. Like we said, we wanted to really dissect what was going on underneath some of that stuff. So as I started fighting this head of anti-immigration sentiment, I realized there was something else going on, or another head to fight. It wasn't that anything had necessarily changed. Of course, we are seeing increasing numbers of immigrants. There was heavy deportation by the Obama administration, which all kind of fueled this, we're scared of immigrants, right? Ideal. But it seemed as if rather quickly, people and politicians, and aka Donald Trump, who we'll focus on in the podcast later on, we're talking about this issue very differently. And when I say talking, I quite literally mean the rhetoric that they're using or not using in some cases. I fell down a bit of a rabbit hole trying to pinpoint who and what groups had facilitated this switch into what I saw as a rather hasty head-first dive into alt-right rhetoric, or a lack thereof. And I came across this term, the Overton window. So these alt-right, far-right ideals seem to be taking up more space in not only mainstream media, but also in public policy. A lot of people blame this push towards the right on polarization of the United States. I mean, we're quite literally taking a class right now that is all about this political intoxication that we're seeing. But today I want to analyze how this model, the Overton model, can be used to analyze this shift in rhetoric as a strategic tactic on behalf of the right, one that we on the left ought to be more aware of. So at this point, you're probably wondering, okay, great. What is this model? The Overton model is a model for understanding how ideas change over time, all the while they are influencing politics and public policy. In terms of public policy, it is the idea that there is a range of opinions and policies that politicians can support because they're widely accepted throughout society, and may even already have a place in policy. Anything outside of these acceptable policies and opinions, outside of the window of acceptability, is risky for politicians to support. And to use their own language here, championing for these ideas would be essentially political suicide. Now, I have a graphic here in the doc, Darcy, that I believe visually depicts this model. In fact, it's being used by the Mackinac Center. I hope that's how you say that. I should have checked it. I'm not trying to test you, but I'm just curious, as someone who hasn't really been deep diving into this, what does this model look like? What does it tell you initially?
Okay, so what I'm seeing is, it seems like a list of kind of ideas, and you have some of the ideas boxed in, some that are above and some that are below. And so it has, I think it's trying to explain some things that are okay to talk about, things that are not okay at the bottom, and things that are just outside of the fringes. So like, it's like a spectrum where like on one end, the policies you have are rather focused on
expansion of individual rights.
Yeah, and freedoms. And like the exact opposite of the spectrum is you have policies that like hinder right.
Kind of. So think about it. So think of it like you said, a spectrum or a scale. On one end, you have this idea of policies that are protecting individual freedoms, and on the other end, you have policies that are not protecting those or essentially hindering those rights. And in between those, you have the policies that are like a little bit closer to one end to the other. So if it was a scale, are you leading more towards the protection of those freedoms, or are you leading more towards like authoritarian control?
So what we're dealing with in the middle is like the mainstream. What is acceptable?
Kind of. So it doesn't have to be in the middle of that scale. So for instance, let's look at this like verbatim from the example.
All right.
So this comes from the Mackinac Center, and they're using this example of education policy. Like I said, at the top of this scale, we have things that are protecting individual freedoms, but kind of to the extreme. So we have things like there's no government policy on school attendance, or there's absolutely no regulations on homeschooling, right?
Yeah.
And then at the bottom, we have things which are more authoritarian, as they like to say, using their terminology, right? Forcing students to go to district-oriented.
Yeah, lack of school choice.
Yeah, lack of school choice, right? And there you can already see, and we're going to talk about this, this model definitely has been pushed by, like, right-leaning sources. But still, at the bottom, we're seeing things like private schools being prohibited. But in the middle, we have policies that kind of are falling one way or another. But the Overton window sits where mainstream media has accepted these policies. So what is considered okay? So what are policies that are in place? So in terms of education policy, we have things like online public school is allowed, right? Yeah. Charter schools are allowed. Obviously, those things that are pushing more towards like freedom of choice and like what you want to go to school. But we also have things where like you're allowed to be homeschooled, but there's regulations.
Yeah.
These are all things that, depending on where you live, the town, the city, the neighborhood, are going to be different. So they all fall within what is acceptable for education policy. Does that kind of make sense?
Of course.
Now, I should preface that many of today's sources are from far-right sources of information, like the Mackinac Center and the American Institute for Economic Research. It is important to understand that this model is typically used to fuel far-right narratives of authoritarian control, which I've already mentioned, by the left, where the right is left with fewer freedoms. In an interview I watched with Robert Wright, who's a prominent writer for the AIER, he explains that the Overton window sits where the public has determined is the acceptable level between what he considers authoritarian control on the bottom and individual freedom at the top. The window can be widened or expanded on both ends of the scale, and according to Wright, the Overton window shatters in a situation where anything goes. So that window is a marker of like what's okay, and it can be expanded and moved. This model can be applied to any public policy issue as long as you define an issue, say education policies, and distinguish the ways specific policies pull an issue either to the right or to the left, or in this model, up or down. Yeah. They're trying to avoid that left or right ideal, but that's the same thing. Yeah, they just flipped it.
Works like an elevator, kind of.
No, exactly,
Who can get on?
The Overton window can be used to find where the mainstream support lies. Is the public in support of banning homeschool? I would argue that they're not. So policies that do so do not fall within what is accepted by the mainstream, aka if politicians follow these policies, voters will not be happy. Mm-hmm. So that's what it is in terms of public policy. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, it's tracking.
Okay, good. Now we know what the model is, but if there's anything we've learned as political science students, it's that there's always something else going on beneath the surface. While the Overton model may seem like an obviously biased way of analyzing how public policies reflect public opinion, it also provides politicians with a framework to analyze what they can and cannot say. Let's use this model to look at the history of strategic rhetoric used by the Republican Party, okay? All
right.
So we're going to go back to the 1960s.
Oh, no.
I know. When Barry Goldwater was running on essentially an anti-desegregation campaign, okay? Mm-hmm. He understood that by campaigning against desegregation, he would alienate his moderate base. But how do you compromise with voters who want equality and those who don't?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is kind of similar to what you were talking about in the last episode, where like these compromises aren't really morally correct. Like once you lean into something you know is wrong for the sake of compromise, it kind of dilutes the whole purpose of doing good, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And in this case, you don't. You can't find that compromise between people who are pro-segregation and those who...
I want rights and you want me to not have them. That's not very good way to run a country, you know?
Exactly. But let's figure out a way that we could use that, right? So what he did is he said, well, what if I just argued for the states' rights to decide?
Mm-hmm.
Dun, dun, dun. States' rights, right? We've all heard that. We're all sick of it. But that's what he did. And instead of outwardly saying he was against desegregation, he knowingly pushed to give red states the option to stay segregated, while still being able to deny that he was pro anything other than constitutional freedoms and states' rights to decide. That was a strategic thing. He knew where that Overton window sat, and so he had to sit inside it while pushing that window, expanding it out a little bit further. And you can see where that would apply. While still heavily debated, segregation was on its way out of the Overton window. That didn't mean racist policies were not still in place, but public opinion, obviously with the civil rights movement, was like, oh, maybe
we're doing a little too much.
Right, but what happened was that when we get this euphemism of states' rights extended the window ever so slightly, effectively giving the Republican Party some sort of deniability of outward racism, while still pushing for outwardly racist policies, like segregation. And this idea seemed to be pretty popular. And while he didn't win, thank goodness, what it did was that we saw this transformation into the modern-day Republican Party. One whose policies can be racist, sexist, homophobic, even though they don't fall into the generally accepted category of mainstream support. Because now they could disguise their extreme ideologies into something a little bit more digestible for the mainstream. The Overton window allows you to know where that is. Think about it. It sounds way better to argue for job security than it does to claim you're worried Mexico is sending rapists and thieves. And you can garner more support if you promise to fight the war on terror instead of openly admitting to your plan of creating a Muslim registry. Again, making it more digestible because you know what doesn't fall within that window of acceptability. But you're probably thinking, wait, Trump completely threw out the euphemism disguise and he won.
Yeah, that's like our modern version of this. Because like living in the South, you always hear the euphemism of states' rights. And so states' rights, of course, in your example you just gave, the right to have segregation in public spaces, but also like the whole slavery thing, like, oh no, the Civil War wasn't about slavery or getting or any of that. It was about, you know, states' rights and constitutional precedents. Just saying, I feel very comfortable with the theory that euphemisms are being ever changing, and you have to really watch out for what's going on, you know?
Yeah. And that's why Trump and his throwing out of the euphemism disguise was scary. And we're going to talk about that. And the thing is, that's by design. He won because he planned it to be that way. I mean, the Republican Party had set it up to where this euphemism had been used, slightly expanding that window over, and then now somebody could jump on that opportunity to take advantage of that.
I can almost argue that a little bit. It wasn't scary that he was saying it as much. It was more scary how many people were like, yeah, this dude has something to say. So that's like really the main thing, that it isn't the making of the euphemism that is the most dangerous. It's the acceptance of the euphemism by like much larger group of people than you're expecting.
Yes, but also I argue that, yeah, the euphemism's bad, right? Because you're essentially lying to a group of people who are not going out and doing their own research to figure out what that means, or aren't seeing behind that kind of facade.
Lying? I feel like they know.
It is. No, they know. But I mean, the intention is to get these people on your side, because you know that mainstream public support isn't in support of Muslim registries, right? So you create a euphemism to kind of disguise.
It's the plausible deniability of it. I'm still a good person because this isn't what he's using it as.
I'm not straight up being xenophobic. I'm kind of hiding it behind something. So
a facade.
So that's dangerous. But what we're going to talk about now is how it's even more dangerous when someone decides that they no longer need to use that euphemism, and then they're successful with it.
Yeah.
Okay? So according to Robert Wright, the same guy that I mentioned earlier, the whole point of the model is to understand how to shift the tables more in their favor, and how to do so more effectively. As American neo-Nazi Andrew Anglin said, we need to remain in the realm of the hip, cool, sexy, and fun.
Oh, no.
I know.
Can I use any of these words anymore?
I don't think so, no.
Damn.
By using euphemisms to disguise far-right ideals such as segregation, that's states' rights, you bring the topic into the mainstream, and the more you do so, the further you expand that window, making these once far-off ideals commonplace. That makes campaign promises of protecting job security and fighting the war on terrorism far less divisive, as it's a common trope at this point and allows for people, aka Donald Trump, to push the envelope further while looking like they are advocating for better. So how about some real-world examples?
All right.
Who better to cite for this than Richard Spencer himself? In an interview with NPR, Spencer is quoted saying, "If you greeted someone in 1985 and you said, 'all gays should marry,' you actually would get a lot of laughs. By 2015, gay marriage is popular. What is possible has shifted. That's what the alt-right is doing. It's shifting the reality of what's possible and imagining a reality in which they are." So that's a lot to unpack. Thank you, Spencer, for that. Of course, here he's using LGBTQ plus rights as a cover for ideals that his party is working to pass. But to just be more transparent with this agenda of his, let's look at Roe versus Wade. Roe was a precedent. The Supreme Court had decided to protect women's right to privacy, but as more justices died, more nominations were garnered, and more conservatives started using abortion as a way to garner public support. Of course, stripping away rights wasn't going to be popular, so what do? You start pouring money into campaigns suggesting abortions are killing babies, you build an exuberant amount of pro-life centers, and keep pushing the narrative of government control of women's health care in the media. And when I was thinking about what's an example of that, do you remember the Hobby Lobby birth control nightmare? That was, obviously, that's horrible. And I don't think they ever fixed it. I still think...
I'm pretty sure it's very much still in place.
Yeah, we have to fact check that, of course.
Yes,
but I mean, that was a way of getting this idea, and just because it was negative attention. You ever hear that saying that, like, what is it? No attention is bad attention.
Ooh.
Right? But it's this idea of like, well, let's get these policies that are restrictive of women's healthcare out there. Because if you can do it on a private business level... then when you try to do it on a federal level, it's like not that big of a jump.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That was the idea. And then wait. So they brought it into the media, and now you just wait. You've gotten public to start thinking about this, and now it's time to wait for that atmosphere to shift. So as Wright explained, you wait until the window has been expanded just enough to the right that a policy that would shatter that window could be passed. Because if you shatter the window, you no longer have a guide to what you can and cannot say, what policies are okay. So you can't do it too fast because people won't support it, but you also don't want to do it so slow that that support that you're building isn't working. That's why as soon as they got an opportunity to shift things in the Supreme Court, they did.
So there's a difference between shattering the window and expanding the window.
Yeah, absolutely.
So expanding is more gradual, shattering is just way too fast, whatever's happening.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily... Now, shattering doesn't have to happen quickly. I mean, it could happen over... Let's say the Roe versus Wade thing did not go through. Not thing. The Roe versus Wade precedent was not broken. They still would have gotten that policy out, and they would have just played it to where, okay, we didn't win that time, but we'll win the next one. Now it's been this in the news, it's more people are talking about it. Next time when they attempt to do it, they're more likely to succeed. That's the trick here. Is that you don't always have to be successful, because any expansion of that window of acceptability to the right is helpful down the line. They expanded it far enough to the right that now something that millions of Americans considered to be impossible could now happen. And then it did. But Roe isn't the only example of this. A slightly different example can be used to explain how Republicans handle the window shifting to the left versus to the right.
So whenever you first introduced this to me, I thought about like more of a social aspect of things we're just like more comfortable with now in 2022. And you think of things like interracial marriage used to be like a super big deal in like the 60s and 50s, and Alabama didn't. Ooh, I don't want to be wrong, but it was way late. Like, we didn't throw out that law of interracial marriage until very late. And then I thought about how, LGBTQ rights have very much shifted since like 2015. Like, I'm only like 21, so like I've only experienced so much of life, but I'm aware of like the kind of, rhetoric and the kind of discrimination that has been at the center of that. And so like there's this big, it's not absolute because I feel like my location kind of messes with this because I'm like living in the South. So we're kind of very conservative about all these kinds of ideals, but I can see elsewhere where queer relationships are more, accepted and kind of like, oh yeah, that's just people, you know, but seeing that shift is great. Like, yeah, I'm glad that a lot of people get to feel a lot more safe in like the country that has promised them protection, you know? But I feel very apprehensive with the shift because there has been more focus on transgender, issues and discrimination. Like, it's always been there. There's always been discrimination, but it feels very more poignant with this acceptance of queer identities versus trans people. And you're seeing it a lot in the policies. I remember whenever I was younger at Obama years, it was always like the bathrooms thing, which is something we're still working on right now. And it just feels like, here's the Overton window. Queer people exist and they should be protected by the government. That's inside the window right now. But still on the fringes is that transgender people deserve respect and the opportunity to seek out gender affirming healthcare if they so choose. That's still on the fringes, and that's we haven't moved over there yet. On the outside of the Overton model. Yeah.
No, exactly. And I mean, we've got like so many anti-transgender identity bills. I mean, we have in Pennsylvania, we have HB 972, which is like it has to do with sports, right? Mm-hmm. We've got all that stuff going on with like schools wanting to basically pull up people's skirts and make people prove their gender, right? So which isn't possible. As homosexuality has started to enter that window a little bit more, has become more accepted. That doesn't mean the discrimination has gone away, but it means the focus of the alt-right, and I say the alt-right, I'm not talking about moderate Republicans here, even though, they, obviously that is an issue. We're talking about alt-right, anti-trans language. I mean, the people who are like beating people up in the streets, right? People who are like holding what is it? There are people who are like burning the trans flags. That's the people I'm talking about here, right? It's like, well, we all know people now who have come out of the closet. We all have cousins and uncles and siblings that have done this. Well, now let's go to this other marginalized group because now we know too many people. It's getting too messy, right? How can we shift it that much further to the right? And so this, transphobia has kind of taken the center of this. That's a really good example of what the right does when the model doesn't shift in their direction. A lot of the stuff I was reading online was by right leaders and sponsors of this ideal, and they're all talking about, okay, it's bad if we're going towards authoritarian control, which is a euphemism for left-wing ideals. So as homosexuality has kind of entered the Overton window of acceptability for, a large population of people, there has to be a new target, a new way to garner support, a new way to take these people who are scared of change, scared of new things, and get them to expand that window more right. And so what do? You take this group that has always been on the outskirts of things, even within the LGBTQ plus community, and we start focusing on them because they're new, they're different. It's something that we were kind of straight up just ignoring for a long time, even within the left. We just kind of ignored this issue for a while. So what does the right want to do? Well, let's take this idea that's right on the outside of the fringe of the Overton model, let's bring it on the inside and try to expand this anti-trans rhetoric into what's acceptable. Because when you do that, then public policies that are going to allow schools to search children to see what their real, biological sex is, or ban these kind of conversations, becomes more acceptable, and those policies can be won over. And so that's kind of what we're seeing right now. So outside of the Overton model, it is understood that saying certain things will alienate your moderate base while fueling a fire for extremists in your groups, the ones whose policies you might support but aren't willing to do so overtly because you understand where that line is between what's okay and what's not. But while moderate Republicans, and I'm taking this from moderaterepublican.org, okay?
Okay.
While moderate Republicans often support gay rights, a woman's right to choose, climate change initiatives, and abolition of the death penalty, when given the option between voting blue and voting for someone like Donald Trump, 92% of validated voters reported to Pew Research that they voted for Trump. In fact, Trump even claimed at one point he could shoot somebody and he wouldn't lose any voters. Why is that? I believe that the Overton window helps explain this. Thinking back to the 2016 elections, we're starting to hear about Donald Trump in the news. Every story is rather shocking, but eventually the tone shifts. A simple Google search Filtering out current news will show this. He goes from essentially a homophobic, slightly racist businessman / media personality to a Republican nominee in a matter of months, weeks even. What I mean by this is that the news coverage shift their opinion on him, right? Mm-hmm. Why? Because he became a truth teller for the party. He started saying things that others wouldn't say out of fear or disapproval. He threw out that euphemism disguise, and it worked. The public had been overtly introduced to the idea of fearing immigrants for so long by other Republican leaders that when somebody finally outwardly shared this fear, it seemed honest, timely, and something people could get behind because it seemed new and fresh. And by the time he came along, the moderates who had been moved so far right as that window expanded, right, they now are more closely aligned with those from the far right than they are the Democrats, who may even have the exact same values. And when we understand partisan intoxication, right, you're more likely to vote with the people who share that label, that Republican label, than, I would never vote Democratic. You're going to vote for Donald Trump even if you don't necessarily agree because he's supposed to have the right ideals. Understanding how these pieces work together is important to understand how these racial ideologies make their way not only onto the Congress floor, but in the White House in its entirety, right? Mm-hmm. So why does it matter? It matters because as of right now, people who are worse than Donald Trump, people that I've quoted today, like Richard Spencer, Carl Benjamin, and David Duke, are utilizing this model to expand the window right beneath our noses. By writing off these extremists as polarized, we don't give credit to the strategic attempts to control what is and what is not socially acceptable. After learning about this model and becoming more aware of the euphemisms, I have definitely, just in the past couple weeks, started looking at everything far more critically. And I know that's crazy to say, just learning about this model, but it's not that. It's the combination of that there is a model that exists that tells politicians what they can and cannot say was mind-blowing to me. I just thought it was, if you had a conscience, you knew what was and what was not okay, but this model kind of helps shape that. And then when you understand the combination of that model with the idea of a euphemism and the throwing out of that euphemism, you start looking at things a lot differently, at least for me. If there's anything to learn from this podcast, is that it's important to do just that, to look at things far more critically. We came in here going to talk about anti-immigration sentiment, but as that's important, but right now we're talking about modern day application of that sentiment. How are they disguising how are they getting so many people to be okay with this idea? And it's because it's been the strategic attempt to expand the Overton window in a way that makes those ideas seem a little bit more commonplace. At this point, it's easy to see where this model has played a role in the Republican agenda setting, but not to play a Joe Biden card here, but how could this understanding apply across the aisle and to the left? That was something I was wondering. Okay, so we understand how the right's using it, but I was really having trouble understanding what this means for the left. Where does that window fall?
Yeah, because upon further from listening to you, from your initial ideas for the podcast, I was like, okay, where does the left utilize this at all? Is there any because there's clearly benefits to it. It keeps you out of trouble for the most part. It provides moderate voters, and it just seems too good to not utilize on both sides. And so I believe, was it your idea about how we have an Overton window in the left? However, it's more of the conservative right are more willing to expand the window than liberals are. It's
expand what policies and issues and ideals get to be in that window. Is that what you mean?
It's who gets accepted in general. So our, what's the word for it? It's forget it. Who gets to be in the club, basically. So
that makes a lot of sense, because when I was researching this, the name Carl Benjamin came up, and I talked about him, and he's also known as Sargon of Akkad, which is a super egotistical thing. He's comparing himself to this Mesopotamian ruler who, who conquered what is now Western Iran and stuff. And
these are things we want to associate ourselves
Well, no,
with.
exactly. I mean, he's got like 308 million views on YouTube. Like, he's got the ear of the people who are making
There are
these
game
policy.
podcasts that have more, but keep going.
Okay, well, so that's a lot of views to have somebody who believes what I'm about to say. So, you're talking about like who gets to be included in the club, whose ideas get to be heard. He had a whole video. He had a whole rant that he went on talking about mainstream media and the ideas that are allowed in that. And so originally he said that mainstream media should include voices of people from the hard left, as he calls it, from liberals, from Christians, from factory workers. I mean, yeah, let's talk. But then he also included neo-Nazis. I mean, he had a diagram where he was like drawing a circle over the voices that should be included, and he quite literally said, all these people should be included.
Everyone gets a seat at the table.
Everyone gets a seat at the table, even if they're neo-Nazis. Overton window on the left smaller? Are we more willing to exclude people out of that? And I'd say, yeah, for sure. There's not room on the left to, I mean, maybe if we're talking about Democrats in general, I mean, maybe so. But when we're talking about actual, like, left-leaning, past that kind of centrist Democrat that we're looking at, it's a VIP club. You cannot be a neo-Nazi in here in order to really have an opinion in any. What Carl Benjamin said, I'm not going to call him Sargon of Akkad. What he said was that we weren't giving people a platform to raise issues that they had, so we wouldn't know what problems they were facing, and we wouldn't know how to fix those issues. But I'm like, why do I need to know what the neo-Nazis' platform is? Like, why, you know?
I think I'm aware of it, you know? We almost want to say it's bad that we have this constricted outline of who gets to be in the club, but, like, we are currently occupying this political system that acts like it's for compromise. As we stated earlier, the compromise is I get rights, I don't get rights.
You don't.
You do get rights. And, like, you don't get a compromise out of this. So this unwillingness to compromise might actually be more of a strong suit than we're actually saying, for the left at least. And so, like, what we're seeing with the right is they're willing to accept more people, and more groups, and more ideals. So, like, that's where we see, like, yes, you have regular conservative Republicans, but also on the fringes of that, you have neo-Nazis and stuff, and white supremacists. And you're like, well, they can come to the barbecue. Yeah. There's plenty of potato salad for everyone. But, like,
part of it's a numbers game, though.
It's a numbers game as well. It's like, well, it's either us versus them, and if we can add more of us, we kind of got this, you know?
Yeah. Let's think back to our capstone class, right? Okay. We're talking about political intoxication, and there's a lot of discussion in that class about compromise. Not necessarily compromise, but about being willing to hear
flexibility.
Flexibility of that model of acceptability. I mean, just in class the other day, a professor was talking about importance of college for being an opportunity for people, and he gave an example of people on the left to hear out people on the right and maybe realize, oh, you know, they're different than me, but maybe they have some idea. I kind of get what he's saying. It's like, try to appeal to this moderate base, right? Because these people on this moderate side are just kind of they're intoxicated with their own partisanship, right? They're kind of stuck. Maybe let's try to pull them out. But a lot of the times that rhetoric of, like, you know, reaching across the aisle is just not possible.
As we saw in the last writing, like, he kind of said this after we had read this whole article of these researchers trying to find out, like, okay, we introduce certain opposite views in, like, social media. Are we gonna feel more or less? Are we gonna move? Are we gonna shift?
Is our window gonna shift?
Is our window gonna shift? And the answer ended up being no. And if we do shift, we're more conservative or we're more liberal. It's not, compromise doesn't really happen the way that we expect it. It's not the sharing is caring vibe that we get from preschool. It's big kid world. I don't know.
No, that's a really good point. That the idea is that we're all going to just get together in Congress and we're going to work together to draft these.
After we, like, drag each other through the mud through midterms and stuff.
Right. After, you know, the entire Senate is refusing to budge on policies like healthcare or guns rights or women's access or autonomy over their own body. These are things that people won't budge on. So they have their own Overton window of what's acceptable. It's okay for them to say that women shouldn't have bodily autonomy over, themselves. But our window's very different. So how do you overlap those two? And is there an overarching Overton window for all mainstream policy and issues? I don't think there is.
what you brought up about autonomy, what you really see right now, what I've seen especially, is after the overturning of Roe v. Wade, there was more talk about banning contraception and banning birth control and stuff. And I'm like, surely we're not thinking about getting rid of these staples of like life, you know? And it's just like, it's easing us into, like, right now we're like, yeah, that sounds stupid. Why would we go back? But it's
on the fringe of that
it's on the fringe of that model. And they're trying to ease it in to where, like, when it does happen, or whenever they try to push for it to actually happen, we've already been introduced to the idea of it. We've already had time to process it. It's not going to shatter the model. It's just going to ease in.
Yeah.
We're going to be upset about it, but it could ease in just as easily. And that's why we need to keep ultra vigilant about the type of rhetoric we're using, especially in the political space.
No, I completely agree. And that's why we're talking about this model, because, yeah, a lot of this seems pretty simple, that bad people lie about things and use euphemisms to disguise the, you know, the dirty stuff they don't want to talk about. But understanding that it's in a strategic effort on the side of this party to know what the next step is on this agenda is really important, because before it used to be there's no way they're going to come for Roe versus Wade. That doesn't make, they're not going to do it. And that's why we saw, I'm going to call him out here. I'm going to call him out.
Oh, she's going to call him out.
Obama. Okay. Republicans win low. They said, we are just not going to vote on a Supreme Court. We're just not going to do it. They don't necessarily have the right to do that. They just didn't. And instead of Obama going, well, I'm just going to
now we have a Supreme Court justice.
Right? He sits and he waits for like over 200 something days. It was like a very, very long time. Trump comes in and he gets an extra seat. I'm not blaming Obama for the overturning of Roe versus Wade, but I'm saying this idea of like, that's not going to happen.
Well, we were talking about this yesterday in my like foreign policy class about how personality of a president allows for different things. And so like you have Obama, who's already having all these eyes on him. He has to play by the rules or else kind of deal. And then you have Trump coming in, knocking water bottles off, whatever.
Yeah.
You know, just coming in, making a ruckus. And it's based off of personality. It's based off of leadership style, where it's like by the book versus I'm here to do what I want. And so you have those kind of results off of personality.
Yeah. But not only that, I think Obama believes in democracy. He believes,
which was a mistake, but keep going.
Well, not that believing in democracy is wrong, but believing in the Constitution and the way that we have set up our government, that if somebody is doing something wrong, they're going to be held accountable for that. And so Obama was like, no, I'm not going to go low. I'm going to go high. I'm going to do the right thing here.
It's not even high, really. It's what I'm supposed to do. You know, it's the bare minimum. This is what the Constitution tells me to do.
Right.
I'm playing by the rules.
Right. But playing by the rules by all kinds of people is what led us to this situation, right? And so it's kind of, when we're talking about the Overton window, it also applies to like what our next step's going to be as well. Like, where is what we're allowed to do? Like, we're talking about like, AOC would be a good example of this, right? She's a Democrat and she's obviously very left, but she's kind of saying the things that the Democratic Party hasn't
gotten
fully
to yet.
Like expanded over that far, right? But she's also saying and doing and going out in her community and doing things differently.
She's laying the groundwork for us to be able to ease into it.
Exactly. She's doing things differently than a lot of Democrats have done ever. And because she's realizing that, well, Republicans are going to do things a certain way. They have an agenda. They have a goal, right? They're coming for contraceptives next. That's what they're doing. And so we have people like AOC that are like, okay, what can we do to actively try to shift that to the left, try to move that window over and make sure it's not just going to continue expanding? Because, by the way, when that window expands, according to Wright, it can expand on one side, so it could stay centered gay rights to marriage, right? So that Overton, obviously that sits within the Overton window. So they're expanding, transphobia out for LGBTQ issues. They're trying to expand this window to include anti-transgender rhetoric, right? But when they do that, they're just expanding it to the right and not necessarily like moving it over to not include gay marriage. You know what I mean? But there's not a lot of movement happening on the side of the left to try to expand it that way. So we're just going to keep moving that way with contraceptives at Griswold, right? That's what Thomas was like, yeah, we're going for Griswold. He literally said that. What kind of...
We're not getting into Thomas.
He had some real courage to do that. And why? Because he knew where that window is. He knew where he could step in to be successful. And
because there's a precedent for it.
There's precedent. And they're breaking every other precedent because there's not any movement from the left to,
This is our fault, is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's exactly what I'm saying, yeah. So, and I would say that this strategy is working out for the right, obviously. I mean, they have control of our Supreme Court right now, and the Supreme Court basically just gets to make their own rules right now. So obviously it's working, and what we're doing is not working. So by understanding that we need to be aware of this attempt from the right, understanding the euphemisms that they're using, understanding the step-by-step plan that they have, it's not just racist, xenophobic stuff that they say on Twitter. There's a reason that they're saying those things. There's a reason you're seeing it in your feed. I mean, there's a reason it's there, and it's to expand that, because things are not to scare anybody, but if we keep letting them do that, it just gets worse.
Yeah. So stay conscious.
Yeah. And as we head out, I want to give a quick shout out to a YouTube channel, Innuendo Studios, okay? I've mentioned it to you and to Dr. Schultz a couple times, but a lot of the examples I gave came from what this project he did called the Alt-Right Playbook, where he's analyzing the rhetoric that's being used, the strategies, goalpost moving, like we're using a lot of political science terms to understand what's happening, because there is a science to this. It's not just
there's a science.
No, there is. There is a science to this. And this series of videos completely changed how I understood the party and how I address issues like this. And so if anyone's listening, if my grandparents or my mom or my brother are listening, I really suggest you go out and watch these videos. It'll take you a couple of hours, but you're going to come out of it like not just being mad. You're going to have a plan. You're going to know how to handle these things. When you see this type of rhetoric on Twitter, when you see these new policies come out, you're going to understand what that means and what the next step's going to be, so we can try to be more, well, I'd say be on the defense. But
preparation is a good counter for anger.
Exactly. So be on the defense, but then understand how we can make the next move instead. So as we learn, we hope you'll learn with us.
And we hope you'll make the journey along with us. Just know, wherever we go, be sure to be an adventure. Bye!